It's great to see so many of you here today. My name is Yumi Tsuda. I'm the manager of analytics and data strategy at the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, or HPD, where I also serve as the agency's open data coordinator. I participated in New York City Open Data Week the past few years, but this is my first time helping organize a session with so many. So I appreciate you all for taking the time to join us on a Monday morning. I'm really excited for today's conversation. We brought experts from across agencies and sectors who are working towards a shared goal, making community more sustainable through the implementation of Local Law 97. And as many of you know, Local 7 is one of the most ambitious climate laws in the country, setting carbon emission limits for most of the large buildings in the city. So to get us started, we will get an overview of Local 97 from the Department of Buildings. This will ground us in how the law came to be, what the implementation looks like in practice, and the critical role that data plays in making it all work. So following that overview, we will move into a panel discussion with 4 speakers representing different organizations, and we will wrap up with a Q&A. And just a quick housekeeping note, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We will do our best to respond there, or we will take them during our Q&A at the end. So let me introduce our panelists today. Each of them plays a key role in advancing the goals of Local 97. So first, from HPD, my colleague Daphna Ezrahi is the manager of sustainability programs, where she focuses on climate local laws and solar programs. Previously, she was a senior project manager in HPD's strategic planning team, where she worked with teams across the agency to improve their operations and programs. Next, Joe Chavez is the Director of Sustainable Buildings at the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, where he leads the city's efforts to drive the built environment to unprecedented decarbonization, energy efficiency, and resiliency standards. He focuses on developing and implementing building-related policies and programs and collaborating with multiple stakeholders to advance the city's climate and environmental goals. We also have Ellen Wren, who is a sustainability data analyst at the New York City Department of Buildings. As a data analyst, Ellen works on analyzing data on building records, energy efficiency, and emissions to support policy enforcement and public awareness of sustainable building policies like Local Law 97. And finally, Mark Zuluaga is a co-founder of Cadence 1.5. Cadence 1.5's Momentum software platform streamlines efficiency, comfort, and health impacting upgrades in buildings. He teaches building decarbonization at Columbia University, co-chaired New York City's 80 by 50 technical working group, and was previously the CEO of Stephen Winter Associates, where he worked as a practitioner for 20 years. Thank you all for being here and for sharing your expertise with us today. Let's do the substance of today's session. I'll like over to Ellen from DOB, who will walk us through an overview of Local 97.
Thank you, Yuki, for that introduction. I'm just going to take us to my screen. I think we're all here. Okay. So, hi. So before we start with this panel, we wanted to give a short overview of 97 and its data, some context about climate action in New York City. Unlike many others in the country where transportation is the primary source of emissions, buildings account for majority, about 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions here in New York City. As part of New Climate Mobilization Act passed in 2019, Local Law 97 was one portion aimed at tackling emissions, aligning with the city's goal of achieving net zero by 2050. So this is a timeline of Local Law 97. The 2050 timeline is broken up into different compliance periods, indicated by the different colors here. We're currently in our compliance period located in orange, and we've just wrapped up our first year reporting, as shown by this star. So This is a slide from MOCJ. Local Law 90 remains New York City's most important climate initiative. So even before net zero in 2050, there are a ton of impacts that are expected to happen by 2030, which is the beginning of the second compliance period. This includes reducing emissions by 40%, avoiding and preventing many hospitalizations and premature deaths per year, creating over 100,000 jobs, expanding the retrofit market, and bringing New Yorkers savings by having our buildings become more energy efficient. Okay, so great. We have some context about Local Law 97, but who's involved? So Local Law 97 targets New York City's largest buildings, which make up approximately 60,000 buildings out of the 1.1 million buildings that we have in the city. That sounds quite small, but it's around 5% of all buildings in New York City. But this makes up over half the area of all the buildings. It's around 3 billion square feet out of 6 billion. So a big chunk. And what exactly qualifies as largest buildings in this case? So in this case, it's a building that exceeds 25,000 square feet, two or more in the same tax lot or governed by the same condo board that exceeds 50,000 gross square feet. And kind of mentioned here, we have, part of the criteria, what is a building tax lot? What is a tax lot? So tax lots are parcels of land designated by the Department of Finance or DOF as part of the city tax geography. And more than one building can be on a tax lot. So just going to go through a couple of examples of what that looks like. Here we have the gray box being a tax lot, and we can see that the first building, building number, would be covered under Local Law 97 because it meets the definition of a building over 25,000 gross square feet in green. But we can also look at the other sides of the lot in general to determine if the other buildings are covered in this lot. So in this case, the total area of the tax lot is under 50,000 gross square feet, so the other buildings are not covered. In this example, the entire lot's area is above 50,000 square feet, so buildings are covered regardless if the individual buildings themselves don't meet the size threshold. So it's really important to look at sort of buildings and buildings on the tax lot in terms of eligibility for Local Law 97. Going a little bit to the data, like how are tax lots represented in the data and how are they stored? So first, each tax lot has a unique 10-digit BBL assigned by the Department of Finance for record keeping. BBL in this case represents borough, block, and lot. So the first digit of the BBL is the borough code. In this example below, 1 is for Manhattan in this case. The next 5 digits are the block number, which is 23, and the last 4 digits of the BBL are the lot numbers. In this case, zeros are kept to create a 10-digit number, and sometimes you may see the BBL separated by dashes. So how does this information about tax lots translate for Local Law 97? As mentioned earlier, we're really interested in the number of buildings and the gross square footage of a tax lot to determine whether or not buildings are subject under Local Law 97. The BBL that we used before was 11 Wall Street, which is the stock exchange. We can see that in yellow are the buildings too, little area of 240 gross square feet, which would make both buildings covered under 97. You can see the same information as displayed in the shot by using DOF's property information portal, and you can search this by BBL or by address. Apologies, there's a call coming in. And on the right here is that same exact tax lot we've got in the bluish highlight, and we've been talking about the satellite. And you can see the 2 buildings marked here in red and green on the tax lot. How can we tell one apart from each other in the data? So DOF actually doesn't have an identifier for individual buildings on the lot. These 2 buildings would be referred under the same tax lot or BBL number. For Local Law 97, we're requiring building level compliance. So we utilize our agency, DOB's data in this case, with a building identification number or BIN, which is a unique 7-digit number to identify each building. So similar to the DOF's property information portal, you can use DOB's building information search to see what are associated with a BBL or tax lot. So in this case, you can see for the same tax lot of 19 that there's a bin ending in 81 and a bin ending in 82 to represent these 2 buildings. So using a combination of DOF's tax lot information and DOB's building information, we get a list of BBLs and bins that are subject to Local Law 97. This is one part of what you may hear people refer to as the Local Law 97 Covered Buildings List, or CBL. Doing the same thing for 97, and how and where can we utilize data to ensure equitable compliance? So in this case, Law 97 has different requirements or compliance pathways depending on the type of building. This is a lot of text, but we generally have 3 buckets of compliance pathways as listed in orange, Article 320, Article 321, and portfolio-wide reductions here. Article 320 covers private sector and non-rent regulated buildings, while Article 21 covers rent-regulated buildings and houses of worship. And portfolio-wide reductions cover city buildings and NYCHA buildings, which is the New York City Housing Authority properties. So these pathways vary in requirements and timelines based on the compliance pathways. So how do we know which building belongs to which pathway? Our still covered buildings list matrix, which is available on our website, covers a break what programs, requirements, and agencies we receive data to determine which compliance pathway a building belongs to. So you can see it's a lot. Each color compliance pathway and the sections show how many programs and agency partners we have to work with across all these compliance ways to make it all happen. Now, screenshot. So this is just an example of some of the partners that we work with and the data that they provide. One of the data sets we received from HPD, who's in this panel, provides us data income restricted properties, which help us inform buildings that are Article 320. So, of course, this is just one example. We get multiple sources from all these partners from many compliance pathways, and then we integrate this for our buildings covered in Law 97. So stepping back for a second, sort of as we're talking about open data today and what information is currently available about buildings in Local Law 97, many of you may be familiar with Local Law 84, which has uploaded data annually on open data since 2010. So Local Law was passed in 2009 and requires buildings to benchmark their energy and water consumption and has a lot of overlap in buildings that are also now covered by Local Law 97. Back here to our example of the New York Stock Exchange and understanding how data pertaining to 97 will evolve and differentiate from Local Law 84. So under Local Law 84, compliance is on the tax lot level. So these two buildings would have benchmarked together under one tax lot. However, under Law 97, these buildings will report separately. So emissions will be reported per building. Compliance pathways could be different for each building despite sharing the same tax lot. And 97 reports and data would have to be attested by a registered design professional. We're looking to open our data on open data for 97 after our audits and wanted to conclude with this slide to explain what data sets people may already be familiar with seeing on open data and what will be different for 97. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ellen. That was a really helpful overview and a great foundation for the discussion ahead. So now I would like to turn to our panelists. Us started, could each of you briefly introduce your role and share how your work connects to Local 97, specifically through the lens of data? Maybe I know you just spoke, but maybe we can start with Ellen.
Yeah, I'm a data analyst at DOB, and some of the ways our work connects to the implementation of local law includes identifying bills covered by 97 and what their obligations are. It becomes maintaining, tracking, and analyzing data on these buildings and their characteristics to support compliance. So, for similar in use or age, could we find shared solutions to meet compliance? And we also help with updating and sharing our data. So this includes, sharing data about buildings under 97.
Okay, I think I'm up. Hi, everyone. My name is Daphna, and I'm part of the HPD sustainability team, and it's really nice to see so many people here. So our team, sustainability at HPD, but also other teams at HPD, namely the policy team, right, have been involved in Law 97, right, from the early days of when the law was contemplated and then legislated, namely on figuring out the whole universe about how it's going to apply to affordable housing or rent-regulated housing. And so all the questions of who should we count on those under those buckets? How do we identify with them? How do we figure out what's the best pathway for them? We have been involved in all those conversations because, as everyone knows here, right, buildings in New York City are messy. The data we have about them is messy. So there's a lot of back and forth to figure out, again, who applies, how, and in what towards which outcomes. So that's just generally. And I would say, right in the last kind of 2 years, our team has been heavily involved in working with DOB on doing all the work related to implementing reporting years. So that was outreach and policy guides, policy memos, right? Figuring out, once we knew what the compliance pathways were, to actually figure out how people can do them, right, and do them successfully. And specifically to data, again, so we work with DOB on helping them build up their CBLs, but also for our own portfolio, right, in HPD, right, we oversee all of the HPD properties that received financing or tax incentives from the agency, right, throughout the years. And so HPD's portfolio of asset managed building has, right, tens of housing units across the city, and about 1,000 buildings or so are subject to Local Law 7, and the vast majority of them sit under Article 321. So what we've been trying to do as an agency has been to make sure that our portfolio is set up to succeed. Both, again, projects coming through our development pipeline are receiving financing right now to rehab their buildings, but also all the buildings that have been sitting in asset management for many years. And so part of the things that we've been doing is to make sure that our data on our own portfolio, again, just internally, is set up to know how we are doing in compliance. And just that alone has been quite a feat to organize, since even internally we have data challenges like many other agencies here on the call. And so we've been really excited about having built our own internal database that takes lots of helpful information, takes DOB data, it takes local law 84 data, it takes other sources of data to have a really robust image of how our portfolio is faring as it comes to local law 97 compliance.
Hi, I'm Joe Chavez. I'm the Director of Sustainable Buildings in the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. The Environmental Justice is responsible for developing the city's long-term sustainability plan, known as Plan YC, and that needs to be updated every 4 years. Our office is also responsible for developing a lot of the city's major climate policies, initiatives, and programs. And so that's specifically focused on buildings. For then, we work very closely with DOB on implementation and also HPD as well to make sure that they have the resources that they need to be able to effectively implement the law. My team also runs the Accelerator program, which is focused on supporting buildings with retrofits and compliance. And so we need data on buildings so that we know how to better provide resources to these buildings so that they can comply with these policies. And so, that's really essential in the New York City Accelerator program, in being able to effectively conduct outreach to buildings, know what resources buildings need, know which buildings are having challenges, so they're able to provide those buildings with adequate resources.
And I'm Mark Schluwag, founder of Cadence 105. I'm a mechanical engineer, co-founded this with Bomi John out of a shared vision that everyone deserves access to high quality, affordable housing that's resilient to the impacts of climate change. And we've tried to figure out how to better streamline retrofits in existing buildings. And we've sort of come to software and data as like the way to solve that problem. Out of the gates 4 years ago, in partnership with Willdan and Edison, or there was Con Edison is literally connected to every building in the city, but doesn't know what's on the other side of that meter in terms of the infrastructure, like the why. They know how much energy the building's using, but not why it's using that much and what can be. So we've basically been able to build an application that sucked up all the public data across all these different agencies, helped X-ray vision to understand of what the existing infrastructure is, what are the patterns of that infrastructure, compared to other buildings, how does that correlate with the energy it uses, and then what are the opportunities to upgrade that building to improve the kind of affordability and impact of this. We've kind of, through that mechanism in partnership with Willdan, kind of deploy their, for the rebate program, get out and across the market to lots of different buildings to figure out which technologies make sense in the right buildings. And we're really excited to be expanding that and Willdan on the kind of retrofit accelerator to help, go from a relatively small amount of fixed rebates that have to be done to a citywide kind of a couple of buildings that need to be upgraded over the next couple of decades to comply with Law 97. So excited to be here and part of this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for those introductions. It's really great to hear the range of perspectives at the today. So now that we are coming off the first year of reporting under Local Law 97, what trends or patterns are you starting to see in the data, and what has surprised you so far?
Seen some really high engagement with this process. So for the first reporting year, we've had a 92% filing rate for the BBLs or tax lots we expect to report. Currently, the audit underway now, and our target is to audit 100% of the reports. And we're engaging a lot of productive communication between our auditors and service providers. Not surprised, we're really engaging with agency partners, with people on the ground, with service providers, just to get information all there. I think we mentioned a bit in the overview that we're moving from, primary data and information, the tax lot, to the building level information. So this is all really great information coming there for us to improve on moving forward.
I can take it also. So everyone, last year was the first reporting year. So it's a big law to tackle for all of us. And so I think there's a lot of just learnings that we are still grappling with from last year, this year, and then leading into next year and the coming years ahead. And so there's lots of things that are emerging. I think one thing that we learned, and also we're more so that overall buildings do want to comply. They want to engage, right? Buildings want to make their buildings more energy efficient. They want to be able to save an operational savings. They want to make it better for their tenants, or if it's shareholders for themselves. But they don't always know how to do so. And so we're constantly learning and tweaking what can we do that actually helps buildings move forward. And, because some buildings are actually snowflakes, even though we try and have typologies of buildings and recognize cohorts, there's so many unique factors in every building. So we are constantly learning, both in terms of how can we offer, solutions that are already applicable to a number of buildings, and also at the same time really understand that we have to work building and their individual challenges and reality. And I think another that's been interesting this year, and other people here on the call, both DOB and the mayor's office dealt with this in the final months when everyone was doing outreach, right? We have all these, nice data set buildings, and it may tell us certain things about the building, but then we try to call the owner, try to reach the property manager, and then just discover so many things that we didn't either know, or we knew a set of information of the building. And so again, on the one hand, we really need massive, quantitative on our buildings, but on the other hand, we have to have really robust qualitative data to complement the image and to know what is actually going on in a specific building, and how we could both identify them correctly, and then really work on figuring out their plan of compliance and getting them towards a more energy efficient reality.
Yeah, and building on that, services are most critical for understanding a building's Local 97 obligations, and where do you see major gaps in open data or other data? Maybe we can start with Mark.
Sorry about that. So the regulations in terms of assessing your fine, the most critical inputs are, used gas, oil, district steam, electricity, your overall kind of square footage, which has actually been getting more accurate as a result of this law. And then for many, not all, the type of space programming, whether there's a Duane Reade or a Mark's floor or a doctor's office sort of thing, or if it's a mixed use building or that sort of thing that impacts your compliance liabilities. But I think the nigger of that's necessary to figure out kind of what to do about it once you know kind of where you stand is what's the major infrastructure you have in your building, not like every little model number of every piece of equipment, which is what are like the bones of the building. Is it a steam building? Is it a hot water heated building? That sort of thing dictates what are the different pathways that are from a retrofit standpoint, more or less for your building. That's kind of and we do. The thing that's missing to your question, I think, is data on kind of at some scale on kind of outcomes from other buildings that are maybe similar to yours on what's worked, or and when we're in the early days. But I think is going to be really critical to building more confidence in some of the moving forward. It's going to be early adopters, and then people that are literally waiting for the data from the early adopters before they act by definition. And I think, I'll just close with saying there was a OPower, ultimately bought by Oracle, but when they were a startup themselves, they ran a little study and they found, they asked 3 questions of what would more change your energy use? Is it, being the ability to money? Is it the ability to, or is it because your energy bills at your house are higher than your neighbor? And it was the only thing that moved the needle in this kind of survey they did for, consumer, kind of the comparison to neighbors. And not that it always has to be competitive in that sense, but the standpoint of everyone wants to know, I'm a co-op on the Upper West Side. How did another co-op on the Upper West Side do this? I don't even care if it was on the Upper East Side, sort of thing. So I think the more data we can serve up to help people have the confidence that another building like me did this work and reduced their carbon footprint cost effectively in that way, I think, and also figuring out the pitfalls, which technologies didn't work, becomes just as critical. It's not going to all be perfect. So definitely kind of where we still need to go, and I think that'll be captured as a result of the annual reporting going forward automatically.
Yeah, I think those are really great points. I think about what data sources are helpful in understanding a building's obligations for local law 97. And there's, a lot of different gaps moving forward. I think for open data specifically, a data source that we use to estimate 97 compliance usually has been the 84 benchmarking data, as mentioned before. And there is some overlap, but the purpose and the scope differs. So the benchmarking data prioritizes transparency in reporting, while 97 is verified information from a registered design professional or architect to ensure accurate emissions reporting. So things like gross square footage or gross floor area, property type, energy usage, all these things are now becoming verified on the building level. And these are things that we're looking to release in open data and currently don't exist in open data.
Thank you. Dig a bit deeper into the challenges. Can you share an example of a data challenge your team encountered while working on Local 97 and how you addressed it? And Ellen, you can start.
Sure, yeah. I think we've all been talking a lot about, how this is an emissions law, but it's also a buildings law. So first year of compliance, I think one of the biggest challenges is moving from that tax lot to building level information, having which pathway belongs to which building, the number of buildings on the lot, how to best the most accurate, information building has been a really big challenge and uptake. And I think as we're looking at these reports and we're receiving information from agency partners, but also the public, incorporating that information, prove our confidence in what we believe, best representing, but also a building owner's certainty on how to report for their buildings and how their buildings are doing. So definitely taking away and feedback from our partners in the public has been super helpful because I think, the data in some sense out that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously because this is a data law, there's going to be challenges from day one, and it's a data law that's based on a data law, right? And 84 has its own set of challenges and limitations that DOB is constantly working through. So I think the whole framework of this is we're data-based and then there's opportunities and challenges there is really baked into this law. So obviously ditto on everything that DOB said. We often challenges that buildings, they know they may be subject to local law 97, but they're actually really not sure which pathway they're in. And either they don't have the documents literally at hand, right? New owned building went through some serious event. They just literally do not have the documentation. And so we, again, having to work with every specific building on its own figuring out process is something that we are constantly having to deal with. Again, when we know that when we have to work with someone on the individual level, that requires a lot of resources for us as a small team and an agency that has a lot of other priorities going on. Another big right in data and a law like this is data sharing issues. There are limitations on our ability as HPD to share data with DOB or HCR, right, to share it with DOB. So again, we are pushing that as much as possible. We have MOUs, we share as much as we can, but it's not as simple like me just sending Ellen an Excel of here's all the buildings you need, right, within 5 minutes. So whether it's we're allowed to share or just gathering the right data is challenging for all of us. So again, we're working on that in multiple levels all the time because on an ongoing basis, we need to share information between all of us. So that's another thing. And I would say another challenge is that, again, we often want to be smart about our outreach, right? We don't want to send massive emails to all local law 97 owners in the same way because we know that's not effective in terms of outreach and engagement. But it's really hard for us to have smart outreach, right? Because our data is not always right about what applies to what, right? And, one time I remember last year, again, we even sent an email that made people nervous because it wasn't targeted enough and they didn't, we don't always know who reads our emails and when. We may be sending emails about local law 97 for 3 years, but an owner may wake up one morning and only then notice an email, from me about it and then get very nervous. So again, we haven't targeted emails and it's hard for us to know how they will be received on the other end. So I think that's another challenge, again, that we work through collaboratively all the time together and try to make sure, again, we are aligned as much as possible on messaging. So that's a huge priority between DOB and really utilizing Mach-E-J, right, as an aggregating source, as working with the accelerator to making sure we're getting our message out there as much as possible.
And to elaborate on that, Daphna, especially accelerator and outreach, I think that was a challenge that we experienced over the past year in having the accelerator conduct outreach two buildings that are covered by Local Law 97. And part of that was, just who to contact at the building, who's actually responsible in the building for making decisions about Local Law 97 and responding compliance. And so, through DO efforts, we have someone who's responsible for paying the property taxes, but that may not be the person who knows what 97 is and knows that they need to do something. That challenge, especially as long in the year in 2025, and realize there were things that maybe aware of Local Law 97 and that they needed to do something, and the deadlines were working. And so we were trying to find every available data source we could find within city records and even outside city records for BECs to be able to reach buildings to make sure that they were aware of Law 97 and that there were deadlines and they needed to act. And so, I think now that we're through the first year of compliance, we've reached, the vast majority of buildings that are required, and feel fairly confident that the broad outreach efforts that we conducted, both through DOB, HPD, and the New York City Accelerator, we're able to buildings through mailers, through emails, through, in some cases, D is even sending people out to the actual building to knock on doors and to try to meet with people. And so that showed limitations of some of the data that we had, but now we've gone and collected a lot of that data. And so hopefully that makes outreach and connection building owners easier going forward as well.
Thank you. To impact insights from the data influence the way programs or policies related to Local 97 are being designed or implemented?
Yeah, so I think we're, as we're moving forward, we're learning more about where buildings are in the process of their 97 journey and how we could support buildings to meet compliance. I think we have a lot of options for pursuing compliance in our rules, and we're hoping to make that more accessible as we sort of learn who could benefit the most out of those rules. So there are tools, time of use, beneficial electrification, deductions, adjustments, and good faith efforts that we believe a lot of these buildings hopefully can take advantage of. We want to support compliance. I think there's been talk already about how, the data that we're in has helped, do better in our efforts, guiding specific outreach for efforts to support specific types of buildings. But I think for DOB, in our process, we've started developing this tool where we're trying to essentially different sources of information in one place. So learning that Energy Star Portfolio Manager, ESPM, is one part. But we also have to have an ability for people to see, did I file for these buildings? Can I look at my energy at the same time? What does DOB have in my building? And a lot of these other local laws, like Local Law 84, there's a lot of sort of overlap with these buildings. So there's a concern of hey, I'm a 97 building, but what's my progress for 84 and for all these other laws? I think we've learned a lot in terms of the kind of data that is needed just in one place and sort of together and having it live and interact together.
Yeah, and I think where we are now, we are much better able to say what the aggregate of all these laws and the data that comes with them, we are better positioned now to say what they tell us and what they don't tell us, what are their limitations. So I think there's a number of things, again, the Department of Building is thinking about with us. And so a lot of them are really, again, things that we are slowly trying to figure out in terms of policy changes. So please stay tuned. None of them are conversations, but again, all in the mindset of how do we make these laws work better for owners, right? Reach the actuals of emissions and make it workable, right? There's a huge emphasis on making it workable, not penalizing people who are trying to do the right thing. And so that is a huge guiding framework for all of our conversations with DOB, again, as these local laws really all start to converge in a really interesting way. And I think another thing that we've really started to utilize, again, on this kind of circle of data is that as data has in and has raised different questions for us, we then turn to Mark and team and say, hey, we want to work with you on checking this idea we have on this set of buildings. Can you utilize your platform to do this, this check of the building and see what that system can tell us? So we have now more abilities because we have more collaboration and there are more better tools out there, again, from the private sector side, to also gut check different ideas that we may have that, that I can't necessarily just check in HPD's portfolio super easily, our our data at HPD is not a AI-driven software. It is an Excel sheet, right? But the private sector has these really awesome tools. And so there's a lot of interesting, I think, collaboration between us to figure out how do we test different ideas that are emerging from the data to see if, again, it has merit. Again, use other tools that are out there.
Yeah, I'll say, we are a lot about 97 in the data that analyze and project what buildings will need and what resources they need. Thus inform our redesign of the New York City Accelerator, which, we'll be launching an updated version of the program very soon. That more focused on Local Law 97. The past contract and version of the program was written in 18, which predated the passage of Local Law 97 and the Climate Mobilization Act. And so, over the past years since the law was passed and we were still running that version of the New York City Accelerator, we had to adapt the program from what was originally designed to focus more on Local Law 97. But, given the contracting and procurement rules, you're very limited with some of you can make to an existing contract. And so that expired, we had the opportunity to rewrite a new contract for the accelerator program with 97 data in mind. And so that really helped inform where them needs to focus and what sort of resources the program needs to provide building owners. And, part of that redesign was realizing that buildings need data. Buildings need, to be able to decisions on data and reliable data appliance, because, it's not for most buildings, it's not just a one-time compliance effort and you're done. Logan spans 20 years. And so, making decisions over time, capital plan decisions, that can span, 5, 15 years in the management of a building. And so I'm excited to be launching the new version of the accelerator program soon that will help buildings make more informed on their data. One other mention quickly is other opportunity that came up was with the J51 tax abatement that HPD run for buildings. Through the data, we were able to see that there's actually an overlap between buildings that are eligible for J51 and buildings that are covered by Local Law 97. And we said we'd opportunity if the buildings that are covered by 97 and eligible J51 could use the J51 tax abatement to help cover the costs of their work to come into compliance with 97. And so we've worked with HPD to make that possible, update their certifiable cost schedule for eligibles that are covered by J51 to include measures such as energy efficiency, electrification, and decarbonization measures. And so we're very excited also to see that program is included in the governor proposal for the state budget year to get expanded until 2036, which will also give building owners plenty of time to plan with the New York City Accelerator of how to make best use of J51 to cost for Local Law 97 compliance.
Yeah, and really quickly, look what technologies such as AI, advanced metering, or predictive modeling do you think will have the biggest impact on Local Law 97 compliance in the next 5 to 10 years? We also have a question about what are some of the tools that are getting better on private sector side. So Mark, maybe you can quickly address that.
Yeah, I mean, taking a step back from this, or buildings in general, what New York is about big buildings. So we're not going to have, it's not going to be likely that we're going to get EV charging or, single family home technologies like homegrown in New York and exported outside. I mean, there's a whole rest of the country world that's doing that kind of stuff. But when it comes to bigger buildings, New York has the vast majority of, it's crazy, the stats of infrastructure. And I think there's a need to identify novel technologies that aren't like, not nuclear fission, but are just sort of modified form factors like what NYSERDA and the New York City Housing Authority are doing with the window heat pumps that are really adapted to these bigger buildings. And I think there's a real opportunity to, as more incentive to develop those technologies than anyone else. And I think those solutions will be kind of exported out. And I think that's something to watch, like how data can kind of inform that. I'm excited about it. And then I'd also say Local Law 97 is by definition like open-ended, right? It could have been a prescriptive law. Like in 2019, folks could have said, well, what's the best technology available in 2019? Let's make buildings do that just like we make buildings do backflow preventers or sprinkler retrofits or that sort of thing. But it wasn't written that way at all. So I think that really opens up the possibility of the market using data to come up with better and better and more affordable solutions over time.
Yeah, and I'll say, Accelerator, we thought about emerging technology and, use it to help builders make smarter decisions. And so we're excited actually to have Cadence 1.5 and their tool part of the New York City Accelerator program. And so, Momentum pulls in a lot of different data sets with publicly available data about build and puts them all in a single platform and dashboard to give building owners insight so that they don't have to go and find all these data sets and build complicated Excel spreadsheets or buy expensive software just to make sense of their data and how that's to Local Law 97. Another thing that the Momentum tool does is it automates recommendations for buildings based on their data of different solutions that they should, different retros that they should make. And so instead of having to hire somebody to come walk your building and do a audit, the Momentum tool can basically do a quick desktop audit of your building based on your data and make some high-level recommendations of retrofits that can help your building into compliance. And then it can recommend which incentives through the utility incentive programs are available, costs of those incentives, of those retrofits, and then connect you to qualified service providers who can, quickly do a quote. It would cost to implement that retrofit, and so you can project out on the Momentum tool and get quotes, all in once from service providers, and then hopefully move forward with the retrofit that makes the most sense. So I think this is just one example of, technology, like software technology and app technology that is helping building owners make smarter decisions with their data and automate some of that, so that these, smart long-term plans and decisions about their buildings.
Awesome. We're a bit short on time, but final question before we move to questions. Let's take a quick lightning round. In one sentence, what is your Local 97 data dream?
Okay, I'll start. I want a platform between all the government agencies so I can look at a building and see everything DOB knows about it, everything HPD knows about it, DOS, and so on.
Oh man, very similar. Just that kind of shared data set where they talk to each other. Maybe having a uniform building identifier so that buildings or current agency purposes could, have the same ID so that we all know this is the same building.
A close on end performance data.
I'd like to see one-click solutions with all your data so that you don't have to, and all your data would be uploaded into, an application for J51 or for utility program so that you don't have to manually enter your data over and over again, and that it's just shared, can be, in one click across platforms to, cut down on, make it easier for building owners.
Awesome. Thank you all for those insightful responses and for our lightning round as well. That was a great way to bring it all together. We've covered ground today from fundamentals of Local 97 to the real world challenges. To open it up to the audience, I think we've answered some of the questions in the chat already. But start with so
Okay, I can jump in about some of the questions about renters and maybe the co-ops. Yeah, I'll just start, and I'm sure Joe will have to say as well. I think the question about what renters can do is a really and a hard question. Obviously, we don't have any quick answers considering that they are renters, and this is written a lot. It really the liability is on the owner, and so I think there's lots of different scenarios, right? I think when it's a building where there's solid management and ownership, and tenants come together to communicate. Whether it's just awareness, resources, ideas to give to ownership, right? That's if ownership versus interested, and they may not be aware of all the resources out there, right? Just sharing information is a really good start. Driving people, New York City Accelerator is going to be a huge way. If you know about your owner wanting to do this work, but not knowing where to start, right? Having renters refer their own to the New York City Accelerator so they can get free technical support. And if it's owners that, again, that are really not necessarily supportive, right? There's like things are going on in the building. And so, again, making sure that if there's violations that need to be reported, people should, again, work on getting accountability of their building in the metric that we have today. Again, even if some of those tools are omitted. But obviously, it's a good question. And again, stability programs or other there have some renters participation. So for Con Edison, there's renter programs for renters. The weatherization program, which is a state program, has a component where the renters really have to be on board and engaging. And so again, there's different opportunities of different programs, again, that might require, again, whether it's just more active participation operation between tenants, residents, and the owners of the buildings. And then the question about co-ops and condo, HDFC. So again, I think that's a brilliant as well. And it's a bucket that has different types of buildings. So, right, HDFC co-ops, right, low income co-ops are subject to Article 321 of the law, and they had a one-time reporting period last year. And so they have a very different required set of resources for them, right? And that's often the build that HPD will work with. And again, I think those buildings, we are very much aware of where they are, what their needs are, and what we can offer them. And we're constantly thinking of different ways we could expand those offerings or make them better. For co-ops and condo, right, moderate and higher incomes, the reality is a little bit different in terms of which resources are available. But there are a lot of, I think, interesting resources that are being developed. I know, again, these resources are underway. And so I don't know which ones are public, but just the other day I was reviewing a really great resource that one of them from this audience is working on for condos and co-ops. There's new Con Ed utility programs that are coming up that are, again, they're not only for, low income buildings, they're for building all kinds of income levels. And also NYSERDA, right, has really good programs. Again, some of them are not just for LM. So there are things that are out there, but I think it's a lot of this is about how do we get the right information to the people who need it. And the accelerator is going to be really key in all of that.
Thank you, Daphne. We're at time. So that goes our Q&A session. And as we wrap up, I want to thank our panelists again for sharing time, expertise, and perspectives. I also want to thank all of you for joining us today and for being part of New York City Open Data Week. Come with this are exactly what makes this community so valuable, bringing people across agencies, industries, and disciplines to learn from one another and push this important work forward. So thank you again. I hope you enjoy the rest of Open Data Week.